Sharp tools are absolutely essential for effective wood carving. So when cleaning up old carving tools, the things that you really want to watch out for is that there's no corrosion on the inside of the cutting edge. If there is, the corrosion can leave pit holes in the steel. And when you grind to make a nice clean cutting edge, if there are pit holes there, well, that can cause little holes along your cutting edge, and that'll leave drag marks in the timber. So your first job when cleaning up old chisels is to remove any traces of corrosion with some wet and dry paper. You want to make sure you've got a nice clean blade. All right, now look at this. This is a perfect example of a road digger. Look at the state of that. Can you see that the cutting edge angle, well, that's become quite rounded due to poor honing. The angle of the cutting edge in relation to the shank it's not straight, and it's not necessarily at a 90-degree angle to the shank. There's some fairly hefty divots, chunks taken out of that cutting edge, and the tips of the blade, well, they've been completely broken off. So this needs some work. The average angle of a carving chisel's cutting edge should be somewhere between 20 and 30 degrees. And this angle is dictated actually by the density of the timber that you're carving. Now a 20-degree angle, well, that'll give you a far keener edge, but it'll be more susceptible to damage. So as a general rule, you can say that the harder the timber, the greater the angle. Now there are several methods of grinding your tools, and these two machines will illustrate both. Now this is a dry-wheeled grinding machine, which is incredibly effective at removing metal very quickly. But it can have one drawback though if it's used incorrectly, and that's because during the grinding process the temperature of the steel that's being ground can increase. During the manufacturing process of a carving chisel, the steel goes under a heat treating process called tempering, and what that does is it makes the steel hard and very durable. What happens is that if we reheat that steel during grinding, the steel can lose its tempered qualities, and that means that the cutting edge will become quite brittle. To avoid this, we must ensure that the steel is kept cool whilst grinding by constantly dipping the chisel into water. Now another tip to avoid the steel getting too hot is that I only apply a very light pressure when grinding. Now on this machine I've got two grades of wheel. A coarse grade here for heavy grinding, and for finishing I've got a fine grade. Now before you even think about turning that grinding wheel button on, you must consider safety. And this means that you must make sure that any loose-fitting clothing is well tucked out of the way. Make sure that your fingers or any other part of your body are well away from moving components. And it's essential that you always have eye protection. Good lighting is really important when grinding. A good, powerful spotlight will be perfect. At this stage, we don't need to worry about the cutting edge angle. We need to get the blade angle correct in relation to the shank. And this is a good opportunity to remove all of those nicks, and we want to make sure that the edges, the tips of the cutting edge are nice and straight. We don't want them rounded over. Let's make a start. So can you now see that we've got a nice straight line across the top edge of the chisel? And this is called a line of light. Now the objective is that we'll work towards this line when we're grinding the edge angle. The objective is to grind away until you get to the exact point where this top line here meets the shank of the chisel. And as soon as you get to that point, you have to stop grinding, because if you go past that point, well, you're going to get something called a wavy edge at the top of the chisel. It'll look something like this. Now if you do get to that point and you get a wavy edge, really what you now need to do is recreate a new edge, a new line of light, and grind to it again. So now let's establish the edge angle that we want to grind to, and we'll do that before the machine's switched on. I'm going to grind to an angle of around 22 degrees. It's actually quite handy if you can make a series of templates with various angles on. This is an old hacksaw blade, and when I rest this edge against the tool rest and this edge here sits against the grinding wheel, I know that that's going to give me an angle of 22 degrees. Now rest the chisel on the tool rest. The blade is actually touching the grinding wheel. You know now that you've got an angle of 22 degrees. And as that blade touches the wheel, you pinch the blade now between your finger and your thumb, and you want to maintain this position for the entire grind. Don't let go. So slowly and evenly rotate the handle of the chisel so that you form a nice even grind along the entire circumference of the blade. So now remember the pointers that we're looking for. The blade angle needs to be at 90 degrees in relation to the shank. The cutting edge angle needs to be between 20 to 30 degrees. I'm going for 22 degrees. Finally, don't forget those tips. The tips to the cutting edge need to remain intact. We don't want them rounded over. Okay, now as I'm getting close to my line of light, notice how I'm dipping the blade in the water after each pass. This is going to make sure that the blade stays cool. I'm only putting a very light pressure on each cut, on each pass. And my finger and thumb have remained in the same position since the start of the grind. Now can you see how my line of light is getting really close to that edge now? And I've got to be so careful here that I just don't get that metal overheated. So careful. Okay, let's have a look at that finished grind. Okay, so the next stage is honing. Now there's many different types of sharpening stones available on the market, but actually I think whichever system you choose pretty much comes down to your own personal preference. However, whichever one you choose, you're going to need the same techniques, and I'll demonstrate those for you now. I'm going to use an Arkansas stone, and on the surface I'm going to apply a small amount of oil. Now the oil doesn't act as a coolant or a lubricant, it actually acts as a carrier. During the grinding process, it's going to carry away the loose particles of stone and metal to prevent clogging the stone up. To begin with, you need to place the blade of the chisel onto the stone surface, and you really want to try and establish the same angle that you achieved off the grinding wheel, and you can feel it. Before you start grinding, you want a nice straight upper body position, lock your elbows into your side, and that means you're probably going to need to bend your knees. And so when you're comfortable, slowly and evenly rotate the handle of the chisel as you're sliding the blade up and down the stone. Alright, well let's have a look at the finished result. That's not too bad. You see my polished edges along the heel and along the cutting edge. Now the bit that you can see dull in the middle is still off the grindstone, and that's been formed from the circumference of the grinding wheel. The fact that I've got a shiny edge on the heel and the blade tells me that I've got a nice flat angle, and probably the honing's pretty good. Now I'm just going to very quickly show you how to sharpen a flat chisel, but I would recommend that you use two different stones, one stone for gouges and the other stone for flat chisels, because as you can imagine, by sharpening the gouge across the stone, eventually it's going to create a dished effect. Now, I've got a perfect example here. This is a silicone carbide stone, and this has been used to sharpen gouges for quite some time. You can see the dished effect. This is about ready to be flattened off. I'm going to show you now how to quickly hone a flat chisel. Okay, so once again, establish the correct angle. You can feel it. Get yourself nice and comfortable and draw the blade backwards and forwards along the stone. Now actually I like to use a figure of 8 because I think that really wears the stone nice and evenly. You see that? Oh, and you can hear that cutting. Okay, so the result of this process is the creation of a fine wire of metal, which is called a burr. And you'll feel that by rubbing your finger on the inside edge of the chisel. I can also feel that on the gouge that I've just sharpened too. Now actually for the flat chisel, you can just remove the burr by putting it flat on the oil stone. You might just put another finer edge and feeling my angle. Another couple of, there we go. And then I reckon burr's gone, job done. But in terms of the gouge, well, we can't run it along a stone, so we do need a shaped slipstone. Now at this stage, your slipstone wants to be at the very least the same grade as your bench stone, if not finer. Now it's important that the shape of the slipstone fits inside the contour of the gouge or V-tool. Now some carvers like to form a bevel on the inside edge of the gouge. It's really down to personal preference, but I prefer to keep an inside bevel to a minimum. So make sure that the heel of the stone is firmly against the shank of the chisel and the stone is making contact with the cutting edge at all times. You can then use the flat side of the slipstone to create a finer edge along the outside of the blade, and then inside again to remove any fine burr that has now been formed. So your next and final step involves a piece of leather, and what we need to do is simply charge the piece of leather with some abrasive soap. And our next step is to simply draw the blade along the piece of leather. Can you see I'm rotating the blade as I draw it down? Obviously you don't want to go up, and that's going to give a nice polished finish. Again, try and maintain that same angle. And we can also do inside the blade too. Now be careful of your fingers here. Okay, can you see that really nice polished finish there? So the ultimate test to determine whether you've sharpened your chisel correctly is in the carving. And I'll just use a piece of softwood, that's fine. Here you can see I've carved this piece with a really blunt chisel just to show you that it creates all these little white drag marks in the timber. So when you get little sort of talcum powder lines, that's an indication that you've got a fault in the blade. So let's see what hopefully a sharp chisel will do. Let's go this way. That's not too bad. Probably a little bit more work on the slipstones, but in general that's quite sharp and a great improvement on that old road digger that we started out with. A great test for a really sharp blade is if you can form a nice consistent shaving across the grain. Okay, well that's the traditional method of sharpening. Now on a wet grinding system, the grindstone travels through a bath of water, and that means that it carries the water to the blade as it's being ground. So this makes it pretty much impossible for the blade to get too hot. Now fluters can be tricky to sharpen, especially if you're grinding to a keen angle, because the high sides can get hot really quickly. On a wet wheel system with jigs like this, it's incredibly simple. The best bit is that by using the same jigs, you can apply the tool straight from the grinding process onto a leather strop, which has been charged with an abrasive compound. This cuts out the honing process totally. With a simple trick of blackening the ground edge angle using a marking pen, you can ensure that you strop exactly the same angle as the grind. Now by using these shaped wheels with the abrasive compound, you can remove the burr and achieve seriously razor sharp tools.